Okay, that's going. Okay. All right, everybody. Looks like we've got people joining us, and today is our last class of the series. So welcome. Glad to have everybody here. Get my recording started. All right. Welcome, everyone. So thanks for joining us. It's been a great summer. I hope everybody's enjoyed the classes that we've offered and have learned a whole bunch of fun stuff. And you know, the whole purpose of this is to help with your continuing education, and so I hope you've learned a lot, and we'll be able to take most of this information and apply it to your own gardening efforts, as well as your Master Gardener volunteer work. So today we have Becky Carroll, who is an Associate Extension Specialist in our department. Some of you, most of you may have probably met or seen Becky before. She's taught a lot of our classes. She's the fruit and the nut specialist.
I'm fruity and nutty, that's right.
Fruity and nutty. And so today she's going to be talking to us about variety selection and why it is so important, especially in our state of Oklahoma. So Becky, I'm just going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Okay.
I'm going to mute myself and hide my video, and you should be able to share your screen when you're ready. We'll go about 45 minutes, give or take, whatever time you need, and then we'll take the last 15 minutes or so and open it up for questions, okay?
All right, sounds good. I will try to make myself stay on track on time. All right, can you hear me okay? Everything good? All right, you can see my screen. All right, so today I'm going to talk about fruit variety selection and why it is so important for when you're planting fruit trees and pecans. And you know, you think about planting a garden, most of the time you're planting annual crops. And so you don't have to put quite as much thought into something that's going to be in your garden for years and years to come, where most fruit trees and pecans, we hope, are going to be there for many years. So we're going to talk about the difference between a variety and a cultivar, and it's used interchangeably a lot. And I noticed in our fact sheets, we go back and forth between variety and cultivar. And to be honest, we probably are using the wrong terminology most of the time. When we think of a variety, it's a botanical taxonomy word. And a cultivar is more products of plant breeding. So it's cultivated by man, whereas a variety is usually naturally found. A variety is usually true to type, and if you plant a seed, it's going to usually be the same as the mother plant. Where a cultivar, it's going to be, it could be from a mutation or hybrid of a plant, but when we plant those seeds, we're going to get something different from the mother plant normally. And so that's why we're going to use grafting, budding, or tissue culture to get identical types of plants. And so with varieties, you can plant a seed and you'll usually get the same resulting plant. And so they're usually identified a little bit differently. A variety is written in lowercase and italicized, where a cultivar is going to be capitalized with single quotes. So it's a little bit different. So we're going to go through and take a look. So a lot of this maybe should be why cultivar selection is so important. So I hear a lot of people talking about wanting to plant something in their yard. And I hear a lot of the time, I'm from Northern California, or I'm from Oregon, or I'm from Maine or somewhere, and we grew blank every year. And it doesn't always translate. What will work in some areas, you know, Oklahoma is just a little bit different. So what's going to work in some areas maybe won't work here. And I also hear things like, I don't know anyone that's growing pineapple in northern Oklahoma. I'm going to get ahead of the market and make millions of dollars. Well, You know, if someone's not growing a lot of pineapples in northern Oklahoma, there's probably a reason. So, you know, there's nothing to say that you can't try something on a small scale. It's just, you know, it's your time and your money. But buying things that are adapted to your site is going to be much easier to grow. I also hear a lot of people say, I love those cotton candy grapes in the grocery store. I'm going to plant an acre of them. Well, may not be the best choice. Those cotton candy grapes are not going to be very adapted to our climate. They may not grow here very well. They're going to have a lot of disease pressure. I also, when we got started talking about grapes in the early 2000s, a lot of people were like, well, I love to drink Chardonnay, so I'm going to plant 5 acres of Chardonnay grapes. Well, for one thing, Chardonnay is not that adapted to our climate. They like to break bud really early in the season, and they often get frozen back with our spring freezes. And they require a lot of fungicide applications to get them to make a quality product at the end. And also 5 acres of grapes is a lot of work. So starting with a few plants, figuring out how to actually grow grapes before you plant a large planting would be a good suggestion.
Earphones that you use.
And then also I hear a lot of times people say, well, my grandmother, she grew apricots every single year to can and make preserves.
Well,
And so, you know, sometimes people remember things a little bit differently. I remember, to my memory, my mother would send us outside every day to play. Well, it may not have been every day, but we did play outside a lot more than a lot of kids now. But I doubt your grandmother had a crop of apricots every single year, unless she lived in the very southern part of the state. And then I also hear we're on the same longitude or latitude with blank, fill in the blank. So we should be able to grow blank. Well, that's not always the case. If you're in a coastal area, a lot of the time you get different weather patterns, different disease pressures, different rainfall. So that doesn't always make the same kind of growing conditions. So what we remember, what we think of sometimes is not always exactly what's going to work here for Oklahoma. So this is a picture of my great grandparents, Rebecca and Daniel Westfall, and they lived in Lincoln County, Oklahoma, and I'm sure they were familiar with those old standard peaches. They probably wanted to grow something like an Alberta or a Bella Georgia, and those are kind of the old standards that people started off with. And when people today want an Alberta, a lot of the time they're thinking of a freestone yellow fleshed peach. And they were great back early in the 1950s and 60s. But today we have a lot of yellow freestone peaches that are easier to grow and have a little bit better quality. And with Bella Georgia, it was a white flesh peach. We have a lot that are much easier to harvest and ripen properly. The Bella Georgia, the only time they weren't bruised is that point when you went to harvest them off the tree. And once you touched it, it would have fingerprints show up. So there's a lot of new white flesh peaches that are really good as well. And with pecans, everyone is familiar with a Stewart pecan. And so that's an old selection, an old variety, improved cultivar. And there's nothing wrong with a Stewart tree, but there's a lot of newer releases that are going to be easier to grow, have better quality, and work better for our area. And we hear people talk about paper shell and native. And a paper shell is actually just a thin-shelled pecan. It doesn't imply that it's an improved variety, but it's just thin-shelled. So we could have native or wild growing trees that are paper shell. And then we think of apples. A lot of people think of Delicious or Jonathan or the heirloom type of apples. So just look into some of the ways that they grow, some of the diseases they may be prone to, and there may be other varieties or other cultivars that are better selected for our growing conditions today. So the key to getting a successful planting of fruit trees is matching your location or your site to your varieties. And so there's a lot of things we need to consider before we plant. And so one thing that we need to think of is the purpose of the planting. Why are we actually planting fruit trees? Is it just for us? Is it for a market? And then we need to think about cold hardiness and where we are across the country. What's going to work in our climate? We need to consider the frost risk or the date of bud break of those cultivars that we are considering. And what season or ripening time do we want to choose our fruit trees to ripen? We have lots of choices with some of our different cultivars. Then one that's extremely important is disease resistance or susceptibility to certain diseases. If we can purchase a tree or a plant that is not going to have an issue with the disease and we don't have to apply fungicides, then that's going to be much easier for us to get a quality product at the end. There's also a lot of differences in vigor and yield potential of certain plants. And then ease of production is really, really key to having a successful planting. So we'll look at some of these as we go along. So the purpose of your planting, is it just that you want to have a few trees in your backyard? For me, I have a few peach trees, a few pear, a few apple, and some figs, just because I have a 3-year-old grandson. So I want him to be able to come and see where fruit actually is grown. So that's why I am planting fruit trees. And also I like to take pictures and post on social media, have a Facebook page for fruit crops and grapes and pecans. So I like to keep lots of things available so I can take pictures. You may be thinking about a market garden. So you may want to have something where you can extend your season, have some blackberries that are early season, some that are mid-season, some are late season, so you can cover that market time. You may be thinking about a retail operation, and that may, need a little bit different consideration than, say, a U-pick system. And then also you may be just considering doing wholesale or shipping your fruit crops somewhere. So with grapes, you can have table grapes or wine grapes. And so the wine quality and the style is very important. So you might select a particular grape because the winery or the winemaker wants to utilize a particular kind. But it also may depend on consumer preference. If they like a table grape that has specifically maybe a non-slip skin versus a slip skin grape, then you may be considering, planting some of those that are going to be what your consumers would like or what you like best. With pecans, they can be sold in shell or cracked. So you may have a different variety that you might select to plant for those instances. Wholesale pecans may be smaller, easier to grow, whereas you're selling them in shell or cracked, you may want a larger pecan. Just a little more difficult to get a bigger pecan to a quality product. And then if you're selling to a bakery, they may want smaller pecans. Some of our pecans are great big. You can't hardly put those on a cookie or a brownie. So some of the smaller ones might be what you would want to grow. Peaches, blackberries, if you're looking at pick your own or wholesale or retail, lots of different types. Blackberries, peaches, you might want to think of something that's a little bit more firm. There are some varieties of blackberries that hold a little bit longer. If you're planning to sell them at a market or wholesale, some of those things may be important to what you're selecting to plant. So our climate adaptability is very important. And so we can take a look at this plant hardiness zone map, and it gives us a good idea of what temperatures we might expect. But this is Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is always going to throw us something that's a little bit out of the normal. Anymore, I don't know that we really have a normal for our winter or normal spring. We just kind of have to adapt. And choosing trees that can adapt or plants that can adapt to our wild, crazy conditions is very important at times. So even from the southern part of the state to the northern part, there's quite a bit of difference. So we need to look at where our location is and see what we can handle. Spring frost conditions are extremely important, especially with our early flowering, early bud break tree fruits, those prunus type of trees like peaches, nectarines, apricots, even things like almonds. They bloom very early. So we need to think about if we can find something that blooms a little bit later. Fall freezes are also important. You know, I grow figs at my house, and I never get to harvest all of them because we get a freeze. And like last year, it was October 31st when we got our first killing freeze. And so we may lose some of our crop because it doesn't ripen quick enough. Chilling requirements are another thing we'll talk about in just a minute. And then growing days are very important, especially with like pecans. We need enough growing days to ripen those nuts properly. So in the state, we try to look for early ripening cultivars, something that's going to ripen in late September or early October, so they don't get frozen in the shuck due to some of those earlier fall freezes. Some varieties are very late maturing, and so we don't have enough growing days to actually ripen some of those cultivars. So chilling hours are really important for fruit crops. And most of our fruit crops, not all of them, are going to require a certain amount of hours of these chilling temperatures after dormancy to actually complete their rest period and begin growing normally in the spring. And so after the plants go dormant, we can add up the hours between 32 and 50 degrees to count as chilling hours. And so we need a certain number of hours for different fruits to break that rest and grow properly. Now, if we get really warm, above maybe 60 degrees, it's going to reverse some of our chilling hours so we can lose some of that. And so we've seen that a couple of years ago. We were very cool. Then we had a warm March and we lost a lot of our chilling hours. So I think we saw some problems with fruiting on some of our pecan trees that year. But most of the time, our fruits, they can range anywhere from practically no chilling needed to maybe up to around 1,000, 1,200 hours needed. But if you look at the map, you can see like Texas and Florida, the panhandle of Florida, or not panhandle, but the main body of Florida, they usually don't get chilling because they don't get in that area between 32 and 50 very much. And so, and they may get warmer to lose any chilling that they might receive. So they look for low chill fruits that will ripen and grow properly without very much chilling. And so, you know, when you see something that's called Tropic Star or Texas something special, it may be that it's been bred to ripen with very little chilling or to grow with very little chilling. So we need to match what we're growing with the hours of chilling that we receive. And in Oklahoma, it may be a little bit hard to see, but right here is 0 across Texas and Florida, and then each line represents another 200 hours of chilling. So Oklahoma, usually between 8 and 1,200 hours is where we might be. Even within our state, there's a lot of differences. We kind of use that I-40 as our southern and our northern variety selections for a lot of different crops, our grapes, pecans, and a lot of things. If they're more cold sensitive, we recommend, you know, I-40 and north. Or if they're more hardy, then we'll say, you know, I-40 and south, if they can handle more warm conditions or something like that. So we kind of take where we are and put it towards what varieties we might select. It also has a big difference to rainfall. The eastern half, kind of I-35 and to the east, is a lot different on rainfall than to the west. So we can select things that are going to grow better with more rainfall. And the soil type can vary quite a bit as well. The pH and the nutrients, we find that the eastern side of the state has a lot more potassium in the soil, and the pH is often lower versus in the western part. There's a lot more organic in the eastern side of the state than the western state. And there's also the water quality and availability can vary greatly across the state. So in the Altus area down in southwestern part of the state, I know several people that have issues with high salt content in their water. So they have to look at things that are going to work good with those conditions. And then also those people that live maybe in the southeastern part of the state, they have a lot of rainfall, a lot of high humidity, so their disease pressure is very high. So they need to really watch, especially with things like pecans that can get pecan scab. They have to watch and use those varieties that are going to be more disease resistant, where they're going to be spraying about every week in those locations. So for chilling requirements, cherries often need more chilling than most other crops. So maybe 1,000 to 1,200 hours for cherries. Apples are high chilling requirements most of the time. They don't grow that well in Texas because it's too warm and they don't get enough chilling. Pears, they require kind of difference just depending on what type of pear, anywhere from 600 to 1,200 hours. And then peaches can require very little to a lot. And so that's why those low chill varieties are suited best for the southern parts of the country than here in Oklahoma. We want to match those chilling hours to what we receive. And especially with things like blueberry, there's high bush, there's southern high bush, and there's rabbit eye types. And so the high bush are 800 chilling hour requirements. So we think of northern half of the state. And then the southern high bush are kind of intermediate. So we think of the middle part of the state. And then the rabbit eye, maybe 150 to 600 hours. So we think of those as the southern portion of Oklahoma where they're going to grow the best. Blackberries, 100 to 800 hours is all the chilling they need sometimes. Grapes, they don't need a lot. And so many of our grapevines, whenever they reach their chilling hours early season, and then we warm up a few days, they may think it's time to start growing. And then we get cold again, so we get cold injury on those plants. And so we see cracks and splits on the cordons or on the trunks. And sometimes that's due to those low chilling hours. And they think it's time to grow, so they start moving the nutrients in the water up into the trunk area. Figs, they usually don't even require any chilling. Just maybe a freeze or a leaf removal is going to be adequate for figs to properly grow. And pomegranate, they don't require chilling. So the picture on the left is a Russian pomegranate. It's supposed to be more cold hardy. And I planted that at the research station in our backyard fruit tree area. When I ordered the plant, the nurseryman said, "Where are you located?" And I told him, he was like, "Oh." And I said, "I don't expect a warranty on this plant." And we planted these in the early spring. I should have removed all the fruit from, or all the blooms from the tree this season, let it kind of get established. But I'm not so sure that it's going to make it through our winters. So I just wanted to see what the flowers and what the potential for fruit might be. And so we've got a few flowers, and they're very, very pretty. So when we talk about frost risk, that's hard to say, we look at the bloom date. So apricots, almonds, early March. When you think about when our frost-free day is for the middle part of Oklahoma, it's usually what we consider about April 15th. So we have a long time between when they bloom and when we're kind of thinking of being protected from those freezing temperatures. And peaches, most all of them, they're going to be blooming about middle of March. About March 20th is pretty much the time that they're blooming in central part of the state. And so grapes, about April 1st. Some are earlier, like Chardonnay is usually the end of March, first week of April. And things like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cynthiana, they're a little bit later, right? Or a little bit later on their bud break. And then apples and pears usually can miss some of those freeze injuries to the blooms. So ripening season, if you're wanting to have peaches for an extended time of the season, you can harvest peaches from May to even October. But remember, you're going to be having to take care of those fruits from the time they bloom till you harvest them. So if you have a peach that ripens in October, you may be spraying it about every 10 to 14 days from bloom time until harvest time, just to take care of insects and other disease problems. Grapes, July to October can be the season of harvest for grape varieties. So one plant usually is going to ripen all together, but you can, or one cultivar is going to ripen at the same time, but you can choose early ripening, mid-season, and late season to extend those harvest times. Apples, we think of July to October, and blackberries, you can have an early ripening that will be about the 1st of June, and some later ripening that's in the middle of July or the end of July. This year they were all very late, but we can kind of extend that season of harvest by what cultivars we're selecting. One thing that I stress very, very heavily is the disease resistant of what you're planting. On apples, we want to look for things that are resistant to scab, powdery mildew, cedar apple rust, and fire blight. If you really like a cultivar that's susceptible to cedar apple rust, then just know that you're going to have to be on top of your sprays that early spring season, so you can take care of that. We can't eliminate all the cedar trees, within several miles. It's not possible. So it's always going to be around. And fire blight is one of those pests one of those bacterial diseases that we see. And if it gets started, it can kill your tree very quickly. And so this picture right here is the cedar apple rust on apple leaves. It has to spend a couple of years on a cedar or juniper, and then about 4 to 6 months on an apple to complete the life cycle. With pears, we want to look for resistance to fire blight. And, that's, if we want an Asian pear, most of them are going to be susceptible to fire blight. So we may have to be looking at other ways to slow their growth. When they're very vigorously growing, they're more susceptible to fire blight. And we also may need to look at using particular sprays to control fire blight. Just difficult to get the timing properly done on some years. Something we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years with pears, and I know Jen Olson in the diagnostic lab is looking at doing a pear study to look at susceptibility to hawthorn quince rust and Asian pear rust. You may have seen it on your Bradford pears, but it's also showing up on our fruiting pears. This picture up on the top right is an Asian pear. It's 20th century. It's in my yard. It didn't have any of the rust on the leaves, but on the fruit, it was very severe. I think I may have one pear that doesn't have this hawthorn quince rust on the fruit itself. Now I have a dripping honey that's right next to it that has the fruit they're clean, but it does have a few spots on the leaves. So we're going to look at this. It's kind of a new pest, so we don't know what is really actually resistant or susceptible to those rusts. Peaches and nectarines, I always look for varieties that are resistant, to bacterial leaf spot. It's one of those that is, we don't have to worry about it at all if it is resistant. And so planting those cultivars that we don't worry about is a way we don't have to think about seeing fruit that look like the top left. This is an O. Henry peach. You may see it in the grocery store, grown in California. When it's in the grocery store, it's nice. There's no signs of disease, pressure. And in California, they don't have to worry about bacterial leaf spot. So it's not a pest they have to deal with. When we try to grow O. Henry in the central part of Oklahoma, the leaves get holes in them. They drop the leaves about mid-season. And then if it's severe enough, it can move to the fruit and cause cracking. With grapes, we look for things that are resistant to black rot and powdery mildew. There's some of the American types of grapes that are going to be less susceptible to these pests, less susceptible to those diseases. And then also blackberries, a lot of the University of Arkansas releases have orange rust resistance, so we don't have to worry about that. We can also look at growth habits. With blackberries, there's erect types, there's semi-erect and trailing. So you may need a trellis if you're growing a trailing type or a semi-erect type, but with an erect blackberry, you may not need a trellis at all. Apples, if you have very small spaces, you may look at a columnar apple or a spur type of growth habit on your apple tree. And then, so you can see there's a columnar apple and then one that's probably on a semi-dwarf rootstock in that situation. And then pears, some of them grow very upright, and we want to try to open those up to get more horizontal growth and have more spreading habits. Pollination requirements are very, very important when you're looking at the different cultivars to plant. Some types of trees like peaches, blackberry plants, grapes, figs, those are all self-pollinated. So you only need one. You don't have to have multiple varieties to complete the pollination. But things like pears and apples and cherries, you're going to have complementary cultivars that will pollinate each other. There are some varieties that are touted as self-pollinating, but if you have more than one, a lot of the time you'll get better production. Things like apples, pears, cherries, and peaches, bees or other insects are very critical to their pollination. And things like grapes and pecan, they're pollinated by wind. So those are some different things to think about as well. On apples and pears and cherries, looking for those cultivars that are complementary. Many of the nurseries that sell those, large nurseries that sell apples and pears and cherries, they will have a chart that gives a complementary variety or several that will work with those different types. One thing I wanted to point out, watch your nursery location and the tag information on those plants that you're purchasing. If you're looking at buying a peach from California or Washington, like I said earlier, they don't have bacterial leaf spot in those areas. So they may not even screen for bacterial leaf spot in the western part of the United States. Now, in the eastern part of the United States, New Jersey, Tennessee, they do have problems with bacterial leaf spot as well. So you want to look maybe at where you're purchasing those trees from. Those other states don't have the same conditions that we have here in Oklahoma. And then southern states, if you're buying something from Florida or southern Texas, they may be selling those low chill varieties or non-cold hardy rootstocks, things that aren't suitable for our climate. So even though if we look at, for instance, a pecan from southern part of the country, it may be grown on a southern rootstock where we might need a cold hardy rootstock for our Oklahoma conditions. And in Oklahoma, it's not that we get too cold or too hot, it's that we get too cold and too hot in the same week a lot of the time. And so those fluctuating temperatures cause a lot of the issues. And so a few years ago, I know in the first week in January, we were down very, very cold. A couple of days later, we were up to about 80 degrees. So those fluctuations really cause a lot of issues with our plants. That's where we have our problems. A lot of it comes to personal preference. You know, each peach is going to taste different, just like each apple tastes different in the grocery store, or each blackberry has a different flavor. On peaches, some are going to be white, some are going to be yellow, some have very fine texture, some are a little stringy. So know what you're buying before you plant. You want to have that tree long term. You don't want to grow something and then a few years down the road, you're like, this doesn't taste very good. So get what you like and kind of do some research before you plant. If you know people that are growing fruits in your area, talk with them and see what works best for them. Or maybe some commercial growers may give you some tips on what is easiest to grow for them as well. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about each one of the different fruits and some of the different varieties. Not going to go into specifics on all of them because each one may have a different location requirement or may fit your site a little bit better. Blackberries or brambles, which we are including blackberries and raspberries, we can look at blackberries in a couple different ways. We have thorny types and thornless types. And if it's me, I'm never going to plant a thorny variety. I don't think they taste good enough to risk my arms and my face and everything else getting stuck or scratched by those thorns. And so I just mark those off in my plantings, not going to grow them. But you can also look at primocane fruiting and floricane fruiting. The standard type that we're kind of used to are the floricane fruiting. They have biennial canes. The first year the cane comes up and it's a primocane. It's the 1-year-old cane is primocane. It's vegetative. It overwinters and then it is a floricane and it's fruiting. After it fruits, it dies to the ground. There are some newer types of blackberries that are primocane fruiting. So you plant those in the spring and you can have fruit in the fall. And then with a proper pruning, then you can have fruit in the spring as well that following year. So they have different requirements. Some of them may not be suited to every location in the state. But we have on our thornless list, we have Apache, Arapaho, Natchez, Navajo, Washita, Osage, Triple Crown, Primark Freedom, Primark Traveler. And then we have a couple of brand new ones this past year called Caddo and Ponca. I don't know anything about them other than they're floricane fruiting. So I'm going to get some of those to test out and see how they work. But if you wanted to extend your season in your yard, you could plant a Natchez, which is very early, and then do something like maybe a Osage and then an Apache or a Triple Crown, and you can have fruiting every couple of weeks on those. They're going to overlap. Now in raspberries, it's probably the only fruit that I would recommend have a little bit of shade in the afternoon. They don't like our really hot conditions. They don't tolerate freezing conditions that well either, but it's those fluctuating temperatures that give us the problems. There's a lot of different types. We have fall fruiting, spring fruiting, there's erect types, there's trailing types, there's different colors. So a lot of different options on blackberries to consider and raspberries. For grapes, we have wine grapes and we have table grapes. And basically the only difference that I really see on wine grapes versus table grapes is wine grapes are usually smaller berries, more seeds, more juice, and higher sugar content, where a table grape is going to be a bigger berry, more pulp, less juice, and usually less seeds. Doesn't mean you can't eat wine grapes or you can't make wine out of table grapes, but those are kind of the difference. On wine grapes, American types like Cynthiana and Niagara Caba going to be more adapted to our climate, easier to grow, less disease issues. The French American hybrids like Chamberson, Chardonnay, those are going to be a little bit easier to grow, more growth capacity than the European types, which have more cold issues and fungus issues, but you can grow them with more inputs. Table grapes, there's a lot to choose from, but make sure you get one that you enjoy eating because they all have a different flavor. Some things about grapes on the American or the French American hybrids, they're going to show, they're going to be more susceptible to 2,4-D injury. I've never been in a vineyard across Oklahoma that I haven't seen some of this strapping on the leaves that indicate that it's been drifted by 2,4-D. And it's usually not anything that's been done close. It may have floated in for a mile or two away. Those French American types, the American types have less disease pressure. And like I said, you can get more pounds per plant on those types than the European types. Blueberries, important to look at those chilling requirements and grow the right varieties for your location. So that's key to blueberries. The rabbit eye, they wouldn't withstand some of our cold temperatures in the northern part of the state, and they may start growing too early. The high bush growing in the southern part of the state may not get enough chilling and maybe get some injury. With apples, lots to choose from, and there's so many that I've never really even tried. I'm planting a few different types just to look at, but look at their disease resistance, where they are recommended to grow, which zone fits that plant, and do some research to see if you're doing a cooking or a dessert or a storage type apple. Look at the different characteristics for those varieties. Pollination, it's so important with apples to get something that's going to be complementary. They're going to need some other variety that's going to be blooming at the same time. But not everyone that blooms at the same time will complete that pollination. And there are some cultivars that are called triploids that won't pollinate other apples. So you may have to have 3 types if you have one of those triploid to complete the pollination of all 3 different types of apple. And crabapple can be used as a pollinator. But there are many, many apple pollination charts online. Just take a look at those and kind of choose wisely. Some things that you may need to consider on apples: cool nights and warm days are what they enjoy, how they like to grow. And in Oklahoma, we don't have very many cool nights during the summer. So we don't develop the red pigments that you might think of in certain cultivars. And for the shapes like the Red Delicious, without cool evenings, cool nights, they'll be round. They won't have that lobed shape. And then this plant is a new Honeycrisp apple that's in our planting at Perkins. Some of the Honeycrisp apples develop this mottled leaf disorder. So it's called Honeycrisp mottled leaf disorder, and it's on young or Honeycrisp apples that don't have very much fruit on them. It's a buildup of excessive carbohydrates. When you have a crop, then those carbohydrates are used by the fruit, and you won't see this in the leaves. But it really doesn't hurt the tree that much. It's just something that that you might see and might kind of scare a few people. Cherry, they don't like our fluctuating temperatures, our early freezes, and our hot, drying winds. I had tons of cherry blossoms this year, but the freeze late April took those all. And so when we think about tart cherries, they are going to be self-fruitful. So Montmorency, Meteor, North Star, Surefire, those types, you only have to have 1 cherry. But things that are sweet cherries like Bean, Cavalier, Black Tartarian, Rainier, those need 2 types to complete the pollination. Stella is a sweet cherry that's touted as being self-pollinating. So I have one of those. I have some stations, so I'm going to test and see how they work. Pears, we have European, Oriental, Asian. They all have a little bit different disease problems. Growth habits are different on some of the different varieties. Asian pears, European pears are going to be more susceptible to fire blight and to some other diseases. The Oriental hybrids like Kiefer and Orient are more hardy and easier to grow. I really like Asian pears, so I have several that I'm trying to grow in my yard and at the research station. This is a dripping honey Asian pear, and it looks really pretty right now. Peaches, a lot to choose from. The very early ripening, very late ripening will be cling peaches. About the middle of the season, about 4th of July to the middle of August are going to be freestone. So that may play big into what you want to plant when it ripens. And so lots to choose from, lots of differences, but look at bacterial leaf spot resistance and what type of of peach that you enjoy eating. Nectarines sometimes have more problems with some brown rot and other diseases, but they will grow quite well in Oklahoma as well also. Figs, I'm growing some at my house and at the research station, some that are available, things like Celeste, Texas Everbearing, Brown Turkey, Alma. Siema is a new one that I'm looking at that's supposed to be a little more cold hardy. They do require full sun. They're self-fruitful, so you only need one. They don't have very many diseases or pests. I do have one that is being chewed up by grasshoppers pretty severely this year, but it doesn't have as much of an odor as some of the others. So I think that because some of the figs, the leaves smell they're very fragrant. I think that kind of keeps some of the pests away. But the issue with figs is they're hardy to about 17 degrees. So in the northern half of the state, they're going to die back to the ground. And then in the next spring, they'll push up new shoots and start over. They ripen late in the season. And so we have to watch it or we'll end up getting it frozen by those late freezes. Pecan, I'm about to finish up here. I know I'm running out of time. Pecan, the two most common or popular varieties are Kanza and Pawnee. Kanza is very disease resistant, and the Kanza and Pawnee, they pollinate each other very well. Pawnee has a little bit of issue with pecan scab, but it's a very high quality nut. We look for pecan cultivars that are early ripening, that are disease resistant, and if we're not going to be able to irrigate them like they should be, a smaller net is going to be easier to fill with less water and irrigation. So cross-pollination is needed for pecans. So we look for protanus and pathogenous cultivar or early and late pollen shed to cover those needs. So here's my contact information. I have a couple of web pages, one for pecan and one for grapes. And then I have Facebook pages one for fruits, a lot of backyard fruit pictures and timely topics, one for grapes and one for pecans. So like those pages and follow along with what's going on at the research station and in my backyard at Perkins. All right, David, I think I'm done.
All right.
Fed up a little bit at the end, but
That's okay. Thank
I have a
you.
tendency to talk too long when I'm talking about fruits and pecans because I guess I get kind of excited. Any questions from anybody? Did you have any that in the chat that I need to take care of, David?
Let's see. I was going to try to pull that up. There was so far just the only question was about the grasshoppers on figs, how to control them or what's best to do for them.
Yeah, it's really difficult. These grasshoppers are very large right now, and so they're very mobile. So there's not a lot that I'm going to be able to do to control them. I think moving them to another location where there's not so much grass in the area will be better suited. And then also I'm going to put them next to some of those others that I have in containers that have a little more fragrance. Maybe it will discourage them from coming in. The insecticidal soaps, they may help some, but because grasshoppers are so mobile, it's really difficult to keep them away. If you can treat your yard or your area early season when the grasshoppers are small, you'll have a better chance of getting control on them. Yeah, I wouldn't be spraying a lot of things like the oils on the figs. I don't really have a spray schedule for figs because they don't have a lot of diseases. And so I don't really know what is labeled exactly for figs because it hasn't been an issue in the past. David, do you know anything, any ideas what might work for that pest?
For grasshoppers?
On figs? It's
on
just
figs?
not something you really have to.
Grasshoppers are just one of those that are, there's a lot of products that work well. Of course, if you're applying it to something that's fruiting, you got to make sure it's labeled for edible crops.
Yep.
But
and
the key is to catch them. Yeah, the key is to catch them while they're young. With great big ones, they're not going to be phased much at all
Yeah.
by most of the products this late in the season. And that's the problem. They're so mobile that
Yeah.
you kind of have to stay on top
Right.
of them and do your
I
best
live,
to get them, you know, control them.
yeah. My backyard is surrounded by pasture area. And so, you know, if I controlled what I had right here, I would have a new bunch coming in. Someone mentioned in the chat, maybe putting some netting around them. That might be a good option,
Yeah.
especially, you know, use some very fine netting where you can keep out those pests. But I have my figs. I've got some of them in the ground and some of them in containers where I can move them inside to avoid freezing back. So I'm trying some different types of management to see how I could grow those. But it's kind of my pet thing right now. I'm looking at different varieties. I had a friend from Ponca City send me some cuttings from that Siema, and he said it's working really well in the northern part of the state. So I have I've gotten some cuttings to grow from those. So I'm going to see how they work, looking at other different varieties. Normally you see, you know, just the standard ones available locally, but I'm looking to find some other types that might work. Excuse me. I know the master gardeners in Fort Smith have a kind of a repository of figs, and so that's interesting. I'd like to go over there and visit sometime. I would think that would be exciting. So, but okay, let me see. Someone asked about growing mission. There are a lot of different types. I have never grown the mission type coffee grounds in the soil. I'm not sure. It's probably, they don't require a lot. They like to be in well-drained soil, but I have some growing in clay, red clay out here. I do know that figs don't require a lot of fertilization. And so if you put too much nutrients on there, you may end up with more vegetation than fruit. So you have to be kind of careful with fertilizer applications on several different types of fruiting plants, because you'll get to grow more leaves and foliage, and they'll put all their energy into that instead of for putting on fruit buds for the next year or for ripening the crop this year. Courtney, I see, I'll go, yeah, that'll be a good trip. Let's go see the figs at Fort Smith. Let's wait till all the virus is gone, but yeah, that would be fun.
There was a earlier question about fact sheets or information on managing fire blight in pear trees.
I don't know that we have a specific one for fire blight, do we, David?
I don't think so. We have, you know, we have one on, I believe, on managing pears or disease control of fruits, and it might be covered in there.
The best
I
thing,
think it's covered in the Master Gardener Manual as well. So look in the Master Gardener Manual.
The best thing to do is if you can keep your apples and your pears growing slowly, so not too much nitrogen and not too much water, which, I mean, we've had a lot of water, so they've been growing really quickly. But if we can slow that growth down, they're not as prone to getting fire blight. And if you see it start to develop on the tips of the shoots, don't wait. Go ahead and get your pruners and go down, you know, where the healthy foliage is and remove that. Then sanitize your clippers before you make another cut. But cut that tissue off that's affected, and then burn it, send it to the dump, bury it, do something, but get it out of the area. Once that travels down to the main scaffold branch and gets into the trunk, it's going to kill the tree. So if you can stop it early, a lot of the time you don't have it anymore that season. So it may just be like, you know, cutting off the very tip of that plant. All right, someone asked about fact sheets for blueberries. There is a commercial and a homeowner fact sheet for blueberries available. There are commercial fact sheets for blackberry and homeowner for blackberry as well.
And again, our Master Gardener Manual covers almost all of these fruits that we've been talking about,
Right.
and provides some good information in terms of care and management.
Someone asked about how tall do figs grow? Well, when they don't freeze back to the ground, like in southern areas of the state or in Texas, they're trees. So they can be not huge plants, but they can be maybe 10 foot tall or so. I've seen several in the southern parts of Texas that are about 10 to 12 feet tall. But they're very, from what I've heard, they're very easy to grow in large containers or raised beds. And so I've also seen some other ways. I'm going to try to play around with digging a trench, laying some of those fig plants down under the ground, and then mulching very heavily to see if I can keep them from dying back as well. But I had good luck with keeping them in a container this last year, overwintering them in my well house. It's not heated, but it doesn't get too cold. Bring it back out, and it's doing fine that way. So I think there's potential for doing container figs. I think that will work pretty easily. Someone asked about how long do cherry trees last? It just depends on your location and what kind you're growing. We had some at the research station years ago when I was in college, and they were very large, mature trees. And we had a really hot, dry summer, and ended up they shocked down and died in one season. So it's really difficult to say. So just keep them as healthy as you can. Make sure they have good soil drainage. But there's not a lot we can do about, well, I guess we could plant them with a little protection from those drying winds, but you don't want to shade them at all. They need full sun. But cherries are difficult. They're difficult to grow. But I know a lot of people have big, old, mature tart cherries, and they harvest off them every year. So it depends a lot on your location and what you're trying to grow. If part of a cherry tree is dead, should we cut down the whole thing? You can try pruning out dead limbs and see if it will push some new scaffold branches. But unless it's got some disease back into the trunk or something, you can try just pruning out the dead portions. With peaches, once they start losing scaffold branches and you see a lot of cankers and things on the trunk or on the scaffold branches, I recommend planting another one close and then just be ready to take out those trees. Peach trees, maybe 15 or 20 years that they're productive in Oklahoma. They just have so many disease issues that they just don't last a long time. So want to rotate them out, have a tree, plant, a few years later plant another one or two, and then just kind of take them out as they start losing limbs, because there's not a lot we can do to keep them, really healthy and long lasting. Apples and pears, they can last a long time if they don't get fire blight. And those oriental pears like Kiefer and Orient are very long lived. So they can last, many decades.
Becky, we often talk, and you talked about it today, chilling requirements, root stocks. The challenge is, and I haven't looked at a label recently, but sometimes those labels don't give us that kind of information.
They don't give us much. Yeah.
How do we find it? I guess I've got an old book that I've had for decades on fruits and nuts, and it actually talks about the chilling requirements for various species.
There's so many new advances too with a lot of rootstocks too, David. It's hard to keep up with those unless you're a commercial grower and ordering large quantities of some of those varieties. But I told somebody the other day, I don't go to the feed store to buy a loaf of bread. Do you guys?
Right.
So, it's just not my thing. So I'm not gonna go buy a peach tree at the grocery store.
Yeah,
Okay?
because they don't care where they're getting it from. They just know
No.
that people like peaches, so they're gonna
Right. Or
get
blackberries
whatever
or
is available to them.
or grapes or blackberries. So I recommend, if you want a variety that's going to work, or a cultivar that's going to work in your yard for years to come, spend a little extra money, do the research, and order from a nursery that sells fruit trees or blackberries or grapes. And most of them, you can find nurseries that deal in fruit crops.
Yeah.
But just because the seed catalog has Stewart pecan in it, we don't know what the rootstock is. I would not plant a Stewart tree. I would never cut one down, but I'm not going to plant a new one because it takes maybe 10 to 12 years before they start producing. Where some of the new varieties will start in maybe 3 to 5 years. So, there's a lot of things that you don't know. And at the garden centers, a lot of the time it will say, it'll say apple, golden delicious apple. Well, you have no idea if that's going to be a 25-foot tall tree or an 8-foot tall tree. So I would never buy anything that doesn't have at least some indication of, especially on apples, if it's a dwarf, semi-dwarf, or standard apple, because there's so many differences in space requirements and how you can manage them. The very highly dwarfing rootstocks, you may have to look at using some type of trellis or stake to keep them upright. The semi-dwarfing rootstocks, there's a lot to choose from, but at least if it indicates that it's semi-dwarf, the size and the space requirements that tree is going to need. I will say on a lot of our fruit trees, we can keep them smaller by the way we prune them. Okay, my peach trees never get where I have to get a ladder, and it's not because of dwarfing rootstock, it's because the way I prune them. Okay, so there's a lot to do with how you're training and pruning those trees on the ease of harvest, on spraying, and maintenance of those trees. So it's not something you just plant and let go. We have to start training that year one. Someone had a question about had a peach tree, a 5-year-old peach tree that did well and all of a sudden died this year. Okay. Was it, who's this, Nita? Was it in a spot, have you had a lot of rainfall, or is it in an area that it had a lot of rainfall last year? Washington County, yeah, I bet so. You were probably really wet the last couple of years. And so peaches don't tolerate having, we call it wet feet. They don't tolerate wet roots. And that's pretty much any of the prunus type of trees. Those fruit trees need good soil drainage. I have 3 or 4 peach trees in my backyard. I have red clay. I find the most soil where I have a little bit of topsoil before I hit that clay, which is maybe an inch or so. But I plant on top of a terrace or a berm, and that gives it a little more soil depth, so that tree root system is not going to drown in that red clay. But just maybe 50 yards to the north, it's just slightly lower, and there's a little indention in the soil that held water last year when we had rain. That tree lost all its leaves and it didn't come out this year. So too wet is what I would guess on your peach tree. It's been too wet, and it's just causing some issues with the roots.
She said it was a lower spot of the yard, so.
That's it. You want to, the very highest elevation, the highest, I mean, it can just be inches in the soil. A little dip can kill a peach tree. It really can. And the best area for producing fruits is on the highest elevation in your yard. My backyard is much higher than my front yard. And so I have my fruit trees in the backyard on the highest places because when we get cold air in the spring, that cold air settles downhill, and those up higher are just maybe a couple degrees warmer. So it can make a big difference. All right, David says, do all peach trees require cross-pollination from other peach trees? Peaches are self-fruitful. You only need one. You only need one to get good peaches. Okay? They don't have to have, and they need bees. When we have wet or cold conditions during pollination, especially I see it a lot with apples and pears. If it's really wet or really cool, we will have tons of flowers and very little fruit. And that's because we don't want to be outside when it's cold and wet working, and neither do the bees. So we can miss that opportunity for pollination or pollinators being active because of the weather a lot of the time. All right, any other questions? I'm probably way over time.
Yeah, that's all right. A little bit. We're okay. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, again, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in this summer. And I think this is a successful event. And I think this obviously there's a good handful of you, a good handful of our master gardeners that like learning via virtual. So we will probably look at doing this again in the future. Maybe not quite on the scale that we did it this summer, but maybe this winter we might look at doing something again on maybe a smaller scale. But
hey, David.
Thanks. Yes.
David, if anyone's interested in pecan production, I am doing monthly Zoom sessions that if they email me, I can send them a link to register for those. We're trying to cover commercial and homeowner as well, but if anyone's interested in pecan, I'm doing monthly Zoom sessions for that as well.
Okay. Yeah, check with your county office for that link, or you can email me or Becky and we can get you that link if you're interested in tuning into those monthly Zoom meetings. So, all right, great. Well, I think that's it. So again, thanks everybody. Thanks, Becky. Appreciate it. And
thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you all soon, either personally or virtually. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
Yep. Thank you, Becky. Appreciate it.
See you later.
All righty. Bye.